I remember coming back from that MRI, and I didn't even want to hold her. She was a little over 24 hours old at that point, and I couldn't. My brain kept saying, this is going to kill you. You're going to die. Why get her attached to me if I'm not going to be there to raise her? Let my parents do this, because they're the ones that are going to have to raise her when I die. But it's nothing that's ever going to go away. It's affected me in some way, either physically or emotionally, from the day she was born, and it's difficult that she doesn't know who I was before the cancer. There's other far-reaching things that you don't even imagine, especially as a female going through cancer. You automatically think, like, can I have more kids? And that was one of the things that I asked my doctor when she gave me the official, like, this is that stage you're at. And then I was like, okay, well, when can I have more kids? She's like, you're 4 days postpartum. Let's get through this one first. And I was like, no, but I want more. And I remember her saying, she's like, you're probably not going to have more. That was the most devastating thing. And that was one of the things that these other women understood, was how much hearing those words of you're not having more kids affects you. I've had some other issues. So I did have in 2022, which they think is a side effect of like the chemo and radiation, I ended up having a pulmonary embolism, which they just said that, yeah, with everything your body's been through, this is kind of the norm. So then we had the added fun of going through blood thinners. Last year I had a bowel blockage, so that was another like trip to the emergency room and being admitted to the hospital. And it's really hard when your 5.5-year-old asks you, oh, is it a bad symptom day, mommy? Because that's just kind of what we call it. And just like, yeah, mommy's not feeling very well today. I try and work through it, but there's definitely times where I've, been laying on the couch in pain, and she kind of just has to play around me while I'm resting. It's amazing. I mean, like, I think seeing the one where everything's blocked is just, that's a normal thing to me. Like, that's just something that I'm like, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense why I'm having so many problems going to the bathroom. It's amazing to see what a healthy colon is supposed to look like. Like, look, people can actually, like, no wonder people are like, oh yeah, like, I can go to the bathroom every day and I don't have any problems. And I'm like, oh, well, I don't understand that. But yeah, I mean, if you can get that in 7 weeks, wow. I wish that treatment had been around when I was there, because 7 weeks would have been a lot nicer than the months and months of treatment that I went through.
Yeah. Hey, Stacy, thank you so much again for your willingness to share your story. Just off the top, I wanted to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, your family, what you like to do. You're in California, so, living that coastal life out there. Anything that you'd like to share.
Yeah, so I'm Stacy. I live in California. I live in the Monterey Bay area, so pretty close to the beach. I live a little more inland. For the most part, fun things I do around here, I spend a lot of time with my daughter. She's 5.5 now, so I am in that crazy mom life of running around to kids' sports, and now a new, school mom. So trying to learn how to be involved in her classes and things like that. I was diagnosed at 29 weeks pregnant. Most of my pregnancy had just been miserable, and I attributed that to being just what a pregnancy was like. Having never done it before, I was just like, okay, this is just a difficult pregnancy. And most of it, both my mom and my sister were like, this isn't normal. You need to talk to the doctor. And I was like, you guys just had easy pregnancies. You don't know what a tough one looks like. And so finally, I think February of 2019. I might have been around 24-ish weeks pregnant. I just couldn't take the symptoms anymore. And a lot of my symptoms, and not to be gross, but people need to know what these are for colon and rectal cancer, was that I was passing large blood clots. And I just kept telling myself, this is hemorrhoids, this is what pregnancy's like. And I finally got tired and I called my doctor and I was like, I can't take it anymore. I was like, I need you to do something. And he thankfully took me very seriously. He was like, okay, he's like, it's almost 5:00 today. He's like, I want you to go home. He's like, I don't need you to relax tonight. He's like, I'm going to call you back in the morning and see how you're feeling and see what we can do about it. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. And so he called me back the next morning and he was like, I'm sending you to a GI. And I'm like, I was like, I'm feeling better today. And he's like, no. He's like, I don't like what you're telling me. He's like, this is my personal GI. This is who I go to. He's like, I called him. I told him I needed a favor. He's like, you're going today at 12:30. And I was like, okay, fine. So we went, and my mom went to that appointment with me. And, they asked me all these questions, and they kind of were like, well, it sounds like you might have ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. And he's like, it would be strange for you to have a flare-up during pregnancy. He's like, but not impossible. He's like, that's probably what this is. Let's run a few tests. And so they ran a few tests. Those took a couple weeks to come back, which were a long couple of weeks, not knowing what was wrong with me or what was wrong with the baby and all of those things. And finally he came back and he was like, something's going on. He's like, let's do flex sigmoidoscopy. So because of my pregnancy, I was not able to get a full colonoscopy because they couldn't sedate me. And so even for my flex sigmoidoscopy, I had to be wide awake for the entire procedure, no sedation, anything. And so I remember he gets in there and he starts doing it and he's like, oh, he's like, this is an ulcerative colitis. And I was like, okay. And he was like, I would be seeing, he's like, I'd be seeing all of the ulcers right away. And I was like, okay. And so then my brain, because I'm wide awake, was like, he doesn't believe me. And he got a little bit further in and he could see where some of the blood was coming from. And he was like, oh, okay, we're going to biopsy this. And I think even at that moment I knew, even though I played dumb, and I think he knew too. So he takes me back out. He's talking. My mom is the one that drove me to this appointment again. And, he's like, we found something. He's like, I wouldn't worry about it. So he was really trying to downplay. And that was on a Friday. And so Monday afternoon, I was at work and I got a call from my OB and he was like, I just got the results back. It's cancer. And that's, I think, when my world just kind of stood still for a moment. I didn't know how to process that. So he was like, stay calm today. He's like, come in tomorrow morning. We'll talk about it some more. So he brought me in and my first quick question to the nurse was like, I need an ultrasound. I was like, I need to know that the baby's okay. And so we made it to that point and he decided, he's like, I've already called UC San Francisco. They're getting a team together. I need you to, remain calm. And so about a week, no, actually 2 weeks later, finally got up to go to San Francisco, see all the specialists, and it was a very quick process. They decided that they needed to start treating me because they couldn't stage me. They couldn't figure out anything. They didn't know. They knew the tumor was there. They knew it was blocking 90% of my rectum at that point, but they didn't know exactly where. They didn't know how big. They didn't know if it was anywhere else. And so they were just like, we're taking the baby. So I ended up delivering her at 32 weeks. So she was 2 months early. And then obviously she went to the NICU and I had to start chemo 2.5 weeks after she was born. And so it was a whirlwind. I think from the day that I heard you have cancer to the day she was born was exactly 3 weeks. So it was a whirlwind of 3 weeks, and it didn't really hit me what was going on with me physically until after she was born, and having to that's when I really had to face the fact that, oh, I have cancer. This isn't just before that it was words. I knew it, but it was words. And then once they the day after she was born, they started all of the staging and all of that, and that's when I was like, oh, this is real. And I know I've talked with a lot of other patients that you go into that haze of this isn't really happening. And unfortunately, I had to come to terms with that real quick, that yes, it is happening, and what those effects are going to be for me and for my daughter.
And you were 32?
32.
So your mindset, especially when you're pregnant, you're thinking about all the things you want to do with your baby, living life. At that age, you're not thinking of something this serious. You get that stage 3, you just have
Oh
your
yeah.
daughter. How did you kind of cope and kind of move forward, with treatment and kind of dealing with those blows as they came?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, I mean, and that's kind of it's a funny thing because you assume like, oh, I got pregnant, I'm able to carry this baby to term. Like clearly that means that I'm healthy. And obviously it does not. When I was first diagnosed, I went those 3 weeks before I delivered her where I remember having a conversation with my mom and I was like, I need you to be my advocate because I can't do both. And I have to worry about the baby. I was like, so I'm going to do everything I can to keep her safe and keep her in as long as possible. And I was like, and I need you to tell me, no, you have to listen to the doctors at this point. It has to be about you and not about her. And that was a hard conversation to have. I was like, you need to take care of your baby. I need to take care of mine. And so I think one of the hardest things was right after she was born. So like I said, I had her on a Monday. Tuesday I had to go in for a staging MRI, and that's when I broke down. I remember for whatever reason, the hospital had to leave me in a room by myself for about 45 minutes. And I had told my mom, like, oh, stay in the room, like, stay in my, hospital room. Like, there's no reason for you to come down. You can't go into the MRI. And then they got backed up, and I ended up getting stuck by myself. And that's when I broke down because that's when it first hit, like, oh, I really have cancer and I might die. And at that point, I remember coming back from that MRI and I didn't even want to hold her. She was a little over 24 hours old at that point, and I couldn't. My brain kept saying, "This is going to kill you. You're going to die. Why get her attached to me if I'm not going to be there to raise her? Let my parents do this because they're the ones that are going to have to raise her when I die." And that was extremely difficult, and it was extremely hard to not know if I was even going to be here to see her go to kindergarten, which thankfully I was. She started kindergarten this past August, so I was able to see that, but it was so extremely difficult at the beginning. And then I went into this is what has to happen. Like it's not ideal, but this is what we have to do, and this is what her life is going to be like. And I think one of the things that I still struggle with to this day is that she never has known me as a healthy person. I've always had cancer her entire life. And it's something that, yes, you hit that 5 years in ED and you're considered cured but it's nothing that's ever going to go away. It's affected me in some way, either physically or emotionally from the day she was born. And it's difficult that she doesn't know who I was before the cancer.
Oh,
But for the most part, we got into a routine. Chemo, other than my very first chemo treatment where she was still in the NICU, she went to every chemo treatment with me. Her and my mom would sit out in the waiting room while I would go through my chemo. And then I would come home because I did FOLFOX, so you'd come home with the pump for 48 hours. Usually that second day I would be exhausted. And so not only do you have chemo exhaustion, you now have newborn exhaustion. And because she was a preemie, we got to around the clock feed every 3 hours, whether she was awake or not. I had to wake her up. And luckily my dad would take that second day off and he would sit with her all day while I would just sleep on the couch. And every couple of hours he'd wake me up and be like, hey, can you make a bottle? I don't know how to do that. And then, so, it was a routine. And, I think to protect myself, I went into a very, clinical, this has to happen, and there's no choice about it. So it wasn't until I got done with treatment that all of the emotions hit. And I did struggle with a little bit of, I guess, irrational anger. I would get really frustrated, and she was a year old. I would get really frustrated with some of the things that she would do. And it was hard because, my family would be like, why are you getting mad at her? And I was like, I'm not mad at her. I think I was just so mad at the situation. And then little things that I couldn't control it would frustrate me. But we've worked through that. but yeah, it's definitely has affected the way I parent and the way I imagined what my life would be like with my new baby. So
In terms of the surgeries that you had, did you experience any other major side effects that you hadn't gone through with chemo and the radiation, and have those subsided since those initial procedures, or are you still dealing with things today? You had mentioned that your daughter has never seen you healthy in a physical or a mental sense.
yeah, so I still struggle with lower anterior resection syndrome, or LARS. Um, for me, I'm kind of an unusual case. Mine typically swings towards a constipation. Um, so I will get constipated for several days, and then I will swing the completely opposite direction, in which I'm rushing to the bathroom all the time. Which, now that she's getting older, it's not as bad. But man, when she was a toddler, it was a constant, like, you have to sit in the bathroom with mommy all day because this is what has to happen. Um, and so it can be difficult at times. And it's definitely difficult when we're out and about, because I constantly need to know where the bathroom is at, just in case. I still, for the most part, carry extra supplies, so will have a change of clothes for me. I will have a depends on the off chance that I need it. For the most part, that hasn't been a problem, but I'm definitely err on the, like, let's keep this around just in case. Which was great when she had a diaper bag, because now it's also my diaper bag. Not so much now that she's 5.5 and doesn't need a diaper bag. I'm like, well, what am I supposed to do with all of my stuff? I've had some other issues. So I did have in 2022, which they think is a side effect of, like, the chemo and radiation. I ended up having a pulmonary embolism, which they just said that, yeah, with everything your body's been through, this is kind of the norm. So then we had the added fun of going through blood thinners. Last year I had a bowel blockage, so that was another, like, trip to the emergency room and being admitted to the hospital. And luckily I have a lot of family support, and sometimes a little too much support, because any type of little twinge, I have people like, do we need to go to the hospital? I was like, no, we don't need to go to the hospital right now. I was like, it's just a normal twinge. But there's definitely been things that have affected her, and that's what makes me sad. Is, she shouldn't have to deal with the fact that we're at a store and she's looking at something and be like, we have to go to the bathroom right this second. Like, drop whatever it is you're doing. Or, like, when we've gone to Disneyland, there's definitely times where I'm like, sorry, we got to go to the bathroom. Don't care if we've been waiting in this line for an hour. We have to go right now. For the most part, I would say I'm one of the lucky ones that this is not an everyday occurrence for me. Right after I was diagnosed, and so I fought really hard to try and preserve my fertility. And it took months and months and months of arguing with my doctors about it, and going to specialists. And, I was like, let's freeze eggs, let's do this. And, every time you turn, you're getting told, like, no, that's not possible, or no, we can't do that, or like, oh, well, maybe. But, like, I had one of the fertility doctors, he's the only one in our area, be like, oh yeah, he's like, I can give you one shot in between chemo and radiation to collect eggs. We can fertilize them, we can save embryos. He's like, but it's going to cost you about $20,000, and that's not even saving the embryos every year. And I was like, where do you think I have $20,000 lying around? Like, you just heard my whole story. Like, there's got to be something. And there's really not. There's not a lot of help for young women that want to save their fertility going through cancer treatment, and don't have a lot of time to make those decisions. Because that's the other thing, is you don't have a lot of time to make decisions. It has to happen very quickly, and you have to balance with, do I try and save my life now? Do I, but then what does my quality of life look like afterwards? And so eventually, one of the things that I did was to have a surgery called ovarian transposition. And so they actually moved my ovaries out of the field of radiation in an attempt to save not only fertility, but also an attempt to not have me go through menopause at 33, because that wouldn't be fun. And so that was successful for me to a certain extent. I have had some other complications from that, and have, a couple of years later, lost one of my ovaries because of it. But looking at it still, and I've had conversations with my doctors now that I'm on the other side of treatment and wanting more kids, and I'm lucky that at least one of my doctors has been very blunt with me, even though it was hard to hear. He was like, I think you could have more kids, but it would come down to obviously need to go through IVF now. And he's like, honestly, I think you should have a surrogate. He's like, if you're going to do it, he's like, I think there's too much damage. And he's like, I would hate to see you get pregnant and not be able to carry to term and lose baby after spending all of the money to even get to that point. So I'm now at a point where I've kind of decided that I will have the one and be done and be happy with it. But it was a really difficult thing to go through, and to have like my local support group. Some of them were like, oh, well, I only have one and I'm fine with that. And you'll love just having one. And I was like, here's the difference though. You chose it. And that's one of the things that I have to really express to people is, yeah, having one kid is fine, or doing this is fine, but you chose. You got to make a choice. Yeah. My choice was taken, and I get to grieve that fact. So yes, I have a healthy child. Everything is working out, and that's great. And I'm so happy that I'm here and that I get to live life with her. But it wasn't my choice to do it the way that I'm doing it, and I get to grieve that fact.
Yeah. It's hard to put yourself in your shoes and kind of get what that was like for somebody that's watching this. Even maybe they're in a similar stage of life. They're young. They may have just gotten that diagnosis. They're questioning, I haven't had kids yet. I want to have kids as well. What do you tell people that may be in similar shoes, that have not gone through treatment, that have not gone through surgery, about what life is like after all of that, when they're in the midst of the battle right now?
I think it depends a lot on your personality. The after is almost harder than the during, for me personally. Like I said, I went into a very clinical mode, and it was just, this is what the doctors are saying needs to happen, so this is what needs to happen. The emotional part of it hit afterwards of, this is what my new life is like, this is my new normal. The other things that I don't think they prepare you well enough for is surviving. And that comes from just there's differences in your life. And, I'm lucky that mine, for the most part, don't affect my day-to-day life unless I'm having a flare-up. And then, then I get really annoyed. But it also comes down to, you're going to lose people on this journey. You're going to make friends, and you're going to lose them. And you don't know why. And it's a hard thing to deal with when you don't know why it's them and not you. And I know that's, people are like, well, do you want to die? And I was like, no, that's not the thing. But why? Like, what makes them, so like my friend that I said, like, had cancer and was diagnosed during pregnancy. Our stories were so similar. She was also diagnosed stage 3B. Unfortunately, hers came back when her daughter was, I think, 8 months old, and then came back as stage 4, and then she continued to fight on and off until her daughter had just turned 5 when she eventually passed. And so I had talked to my doctors, when I was first diagnosed, I never asked them what my chances were. And part of it, I think, was I wasn't ready to know that. And then also because at the beginning, all of my appointments my mom was at. And I knew this was a really difficult thing for her. And so I never wanted to give her those statistics. And so when COVID did hit and I had to go to doctor's appointments alone for the first time, I asked my doctor, and I was like, hey, what are my odds? And he's like, you want me to tell you honestly? And I was like, yes. And he told me, he was like, he's like, as bad as it was when we got to the surgery, and by the time we got to surgery, I'd already been through the chemo and the radiation. And they found 12 out of 21 lymph nodes that they took still had active cancer, even after all of that treatment. He was like, I'm honestly amazed that you have not hit stage 4 already. He's like, honestly, when we looked at it in January, all of the doctors thought you would be stage 4 by the summer. And so he's like, I'm shocked. And so this was in August of 2020. And he was like, at this point, he's like, I'd still give you a 50-50 chance of coming through this. And so now that we've almost hit this 5 years, all of them are amazed. Every time I see them, they're just like, I don't know how we did this. We don't know why, but it's amazing that you're doing this. And so now I will say my biggest fear, because I've known people this has happened to, is to hear like at my very last scan, it's back. But then I'm also afraid to not hear that, because it's also, they're like, we don't scan you anymore. And I'm like, well, what if it comes back, 6 months later? Like, we just don't. So, there's a lot of fear that goes along with that. And I don't think there's enough support in preparing people. And, it also comes down to the people in your day-to-day life who haven't been through this kind of just assume that you go back to your quote-unquote normal. And I'm like, no, this isn't, like, I don't want to be that person that's like, oh, I had cancer, like, everything's about me. That's not the case, but it did affect me, and it did change how I look at things, and it changes how I go through my day-to-day life. And, I guess in some ways, like, people are like, I get a lot, and this one angers me kind of, where people are like, oh, you're so strong, I could never have done this. Well, yes, you can, because you know what? Guess what? You weren't given a choice. I wasn't given a choice. I didn't ask to be the one that was pregnant with cancer. Out of some of the other people I know, do I think I was strong enough to go through it personally? Yes. I have other friends that maybe couldn't have made it through. But it's not what I would have chosen for myself. And, but you do what you have to do. And that's what I tell people. I'm like, look, I never want my daughter to question like I did. Like, I just kind of thought what I was going through was normal. And that's why I didn't say anything. And, maybe had I said something years before, we would never have gotten to that point. And I'm very big on, like, any of my friends, as they're getting closer to 45, I was like, guess what we're doing? We're getting colonoscopies. Do you need me to drive you? I'll take the day off. Let's go. And, I'm also like, hey, you having a problem and your doctor doesn't want to take it seriously? I was like, I'll go to the appointment with you. Oh, they'll listen. So yeah, those are the things that survivorship is the hardest part of this entire journey for me, which sounds terrible, and I think a lot of patients really struggle with that and don't expect it.
Well, you have a phenomenal story, and I know that you said that you don't like hearing it, but your strength and your perseverance through all of this is really incredible. And I mentioned earlier, it's hard to put yourself in your shoes and try and even have any semblance of an idea of what it was like to go through all of that stuff at once. But I'm really happy that so far so good. That good news keeps on coming, and that there's no more bad news, and it's just a train going straight towards a brighter future, and this can just be a chapter in the past, and a new life for you and your daughter, and plenty of Disneyland visits still to come.
Oh, trust me, she's had too many of those. And my biggest thing, advocate for yourself. You don't think it's normal, whether during pregnancy or not, get a doctor that will listen to you, and just be a pain in their butt until they do.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you again so much.
Thank you.